It's no secret that everyone is complaining about performance in Escape from Tarkov. I've already made a graphics settings guide that seems to help stabilize a lot of people's performance, but some people are still experiencing issues, crashes, and unstable frame rates. And I can tell you why. It's because at the moment there is a massive memory leak in the game affecting everyone. It's nothing that you can do physically to stop this from happening. Unfortunately, it's the game's code that is causing this issue, and the only way to really put a band-aid over the problem is restarting your game every few raids. Take a look at this. This is the memory leak in action. Here's me sitting inside Interchange in the underground, not doing anything for 25 minutes. This video is sped up, and you can see in the task manager the RAM usage is just creeping up megabytes at a time, and it shoots up about 6 gig in 25 minutes. This happens on all maps, for all people, and it varies and hits people with different severities. Obviously, the less RAM you have in your system, the more you're going to be affected. I'm going to brag with my 128 gigs of RAM right now and say that this doesn't affect my frame rates, but those that have 16, 32 gig are starting to see really unstable frame rates where they usually are at 82 FPS on a certain map, and then they drop to 30 or 20 or 10, or even a game crash or a blue screen. Now, if you don't know what a memory leak is, basically every application, every game, every app, no matter what it is, has to assign usage of RAM to certain processes and tasks, no matter what it is. In Escape from Tarkov, it could be inspecting an item, loading your hideout, loading a raid, moving around in a raid. Anything that's happening, it has to assign a certain amount of RAM to be able to do that task. Once that task is complete, normally it should unallocate that RAM and move it into free space for the game to use again. That consistently uses a similar amount of RAM no matter what you're doing in a game, with some increases and some dips. Unfortunately, at the moment, what the game is doing is not letting go of that RAM once it's completed a task. Therefore, RAM is just creeping up and usage is getting higher and higher, even if you're not doing anything but sitting in a raid like I am. For example, when I load up a raid for the very first time, I am at about 6 gigs of RAM usage. That is just by loading up the game, loading into the hideout, and then going into my first raid. After my first raid, I am at 12 gigs or 14 gigs, for example. And then when I come out a raid, it'll drop down, but it won't drop down to that original 4 or 6 gigs that I had to begin with. It'll drop down to 7 or 8. And then I'd go into a next raid, and it'll still creep up those 7 or 8 gigs, so it'll make it now 16, 17 gigs of RAM usage. And then I'll close it down, and then it'll drop down to not 8 but 10 gigs of RAM usage when I'm sitting idle in the menu. And then I'll go into the next raid, and it'll creep up to 18, 20 gigs of RAM usage. You can see how the more raids you play, the more RAM is just going to be held up in the game. And maps vary massively. The more it's got on it, the more RAM is going to be used. This is a very, very apparent thing for the new Streets of Tarkov map. I loaded into Streets of Tarkov for the very first time after a restart of the system, and I was already at 23 gigs of RAM used by the end of the first raid. All I was doing is sitting in a bush. From the moment I got into the raid, I was at 13 gigs of RAM used. It creeped up 10 gigs in that one raid. When I first load up Tarkov, I get 4 gigs of RAM used, without loading the hideout, just sitting in the menu. 4 gigs of RAM used. So it creeps up 10 gig as soon as I'm in the game, and then creeps up another 10 gig by the time the raid ends, and that is 50 minutes of raid time. When it goes back into the menu, I am sitting in the menu, I'm not doing anything, it dips down, but it doesn't dip down to the 4 gigs, it dips down to 14 gigs used. I'll go into another Streets, and then another 10 gigabytes of RAM gets used. That is over 32 gigs of RAM being used, which is what most of you are using in your system, if not a bit more than what you guys are using in your system. And so on and so forth. Eventually, you will reach your cap at 95% used on your system's memory. This is where you'll start to experience blue screens, crashes, etc. because Windows processes are then unable to run because your game is taking up all of its allocated memory. I want to stress that the only way for you to get over this issue is by restarting your game. There is nothing you can do. Automatic RAM cleaner does not help, and nothing that you can do on your system's end will be able to fix this issue. This is an issue on the game's end in the code, which is not allowing that RAM usage to be freed up after a task is complete. Unfortunately, everyone is going through this, and unfortunately it affects some people worse than others. I haven't experienced a crash or an FPS drop, but tons of people that have been reporting to me having FPS drops massively, crashes and blue screens, and there is nothing you guys can do about it other than restarting your game every 2 or 3 raids depending on what map you're running. While I'm rambling on about technical terms and memory leaks and stuff like that, I've put some screenshots of Task Manager up on the screen for you with different timestamps and intervals during my playtesting, and as you can see the RAM usage is all very different, but you can see a trend. After raid 1 is much lower than after raid 2 RAM usage, and after raid 2 is lower than after raid 3. It just slowly creeps up. The more raids you do, the higher your idle RAM is going to be. Sure, you'll see some dips and some gains, but it will always stay higher than what it was when you rebooted, and unfortunately that only gets worse the more raids you play. Another thing, this isn't the first time this has happened. I was speaking to Plorex, he was an OG Tarkov player until he gave up with the game because of all its issues, and he remembers this exact same thing, as well as I remember it, happening when Interchange was released. This happened very publicly when Interchange was released, and it's happened a few times since also. So it's a code issue that's been reported before and has been fixed before, but it always seems to creep up again a few patches later. So what can we do about it to speed up the process of this getting fixed so everyone can go back to a better quality of life while playing? Well, any crash reports you get from Tarkov, make sure you are reporting it. Don't let it just close down the crash handler, just make sure you report it and say what happened. Keep a task manager open on a separate window and keep an eye on your RAM usage. If it gets above 80%, then you know something's about to go down, i.e. a major FPS drop or a crash. And if you don't have any of these issues, still spread the word, because that is the main thing. They already know about this issue, but the more people talk about it, the quicker it will get fixed. Unfortunately, it's something we're going to have to deal with for the moment, but hopefully that explains what a memory leak is and how it occurs in Tarkov, and just little bits of findings from my testing of this in the past couple of hours. I will leave you with the comment section down below. Let's start a discussion there, but thank you so much for watching. I hope this informed you a little bit, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.